Hello, people.
Hello.
How's it going? It is time to drink some tea and talk about tastiness that is high mountain oolongs and kind of explore a little bit into the world of Gong Fu Cha or the way of tea.
Yeah. And we're here today. My mom is visiting, so she's sitting behind camera. So you'll see us pass off a cup of tea every once in a while to her. And hopefully she'll have some questions too.
We'll find out.
Yeah.
So what we've got here for our brewing setup today is just a gaiwan, which, as we keep coming back to, is the most versatile brewing method. Yep. It's going to work well for just about everything that you do. And a good porcelain gaiwan is really nice because it will not have the worst heat retention in the world, so you won't scorch your fingers trying to pick it up and use it. It will also, something like this, which is a white porcelain gaiwan, shows up really nice and shows off the tea, and it makes it easier to evaluate the leaf at all stages. So that's nice. As far as cups, we've got our little small vessel cups. What I've done is I've started by just heating up both the gaiwan and the fairness pitcher and the cups. This is part of that process of Gong Fu tea practice to make sure that everything's warmed through and is really about slowing down and paying attention to the tea brewing process.
Warming your vessels and all of your tools is really important, particularly for Gong Fu, where you're doing a lot shorter infusions and paying a lot more attention to each stage of the tea flavor. And as the leaf opens up, noticing all the different changes. Warming up everything helps not shock the leaf, which can affect the flavor when you're paying this close attention to it.
Yeah. What it also does is it helps, and is a good practice to be in general tea brewing, as some teas can become super finicky with what temperatures they like to be brewed at or consumed at. Case in point, especially things like some Japanese green teas really only want to ever exist in that like weird 65 to 70 something degrees centigrade range, and otherwise they tend to get scorched or end up under extracted. We're also taking the time in this brew to do a rinse. Rinsing, especially something like a tightly rolled Taiwanese Oolong, which almost every Gaoshan that I have ever encountered, Gaoshan being high mountain tea, ends up falling into that category of very tightly rolled. And we've got our little rinse that we will dispose of.
I'm just handing it off because with the rinse, you get the first sense of smell of the leaf. It will, in the process of Gong Fu, it's the first introduction to the tea itself.
Yeah.
Smelling the first wash and then smelling the wet leaf kind of gets your palate acclimated to what you're going to experience next.
There are also, specifically in Gong Fu tea brewing within Taiwan, there's also the addition, generally speaking, of a snifter cup, which is just a really tall, very narrow cup that you fill up before you put your tea into your actual cup to drink. And you just use it to basically shove your nose right into it and get a full aroma of the tea.
Yeah.
So I will dispose of this into a wastewater vessel. Chase, you want to talk at all as I continue brewing up here about just general experience with Taiwanese Oolongs and or in particular this Taiwanese Oolong?
Yeah, so Taiwanese Oolongs are a really fun category because it's steeped, with the pun, in a lot of history. Because Taiwan has always been under control of another country, particularly with its economy. So you get a lot of interesting tea history if you look at these teas specifically, where you're getting mostly plants that have been imported from China with Chinese technique in growing and harvesting and processing that has changed to become uniquely Taiwanese over time. And then there's also a lot of influence from Japan as well, which is particularly seen in the lighter oolongs. Japan had a lot of preference for more green flavors, so it pushed Taiwanese oolong to become famously jade oolong.
Yeah. One thing also about Taiwanese oolongs and Taiwanese tea in general is it tends to be that middle ground between a Chinese tea and a Japanese tea. A lot of that has to do with the fact of Taiwan being bouted back and forth between the control of the Japanese Imperial Army and what would become the Chinese Republic, or the Chinese Communist Party under Mao Zedong. So where, generally speaking, a Chinese tea during its processing, it's fixing. So fixing is the heat that is applied to the tea leaf to halt oxidation, essentially cooking the leaf. And China, generally speaking, that is done via application of a pan-fried heat, so a hot, dry heat, whereas for Japanese teas tend to be steamed. That kind of translates into their flavor profiles being a lot lighter and fresher tasting. That is Japanese teas, and Chinese teas, generally speaking, I find tend to have more of those kind of cooked flavors, cooked notes, a bit more nutty, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Taiwanese teas also tend, so with the vegetableness and the freshness, they also tend to be a little bit more floral, particularly when you get into the high mountain oolong and you get the effects of the high mountain terroir of being infused with good nutrients from mist and less traveled earth.
Where Taiwan tea culture is also interesting is most of the prominent tea plantations are actually converted from old orchards, fruit orchards, mostly because at a time it became more advantageous to just import fruits from mainland China over than it was to grow them and produce in-house. So some savvy farmers realized that if they are smart enough to adjust, they could keep their land and keep space going.
Yeah, and you really see that with this month's Lishan. Lishan translates to Peach Mountain, and there are still peach orchards on that mountain, and I think it's a good resort area as well for the orchards and the tea.
You'll also get another very popular Taiwanese high mountain oolong, Alishan, translates to Pear Mountain.
Mm-hmm.
There's gotta love them fruits.
Yeah. And you can kind of get some fruitiness out of this tea. I think particularly when it's cold brewed, you get a little bit of the fruity notes. When it's hotter, and with gong fu brewing, you get a lot more of the light floral and vegetalness.
One of the benefits of gong fu brewing, which is the first tenet of it, is using high amount of leaf, low amount of water for quick infusions, is you get to pull out every possible flavor note potentially in the cup through subsequent brewings. So it's a really good way to get to know a tea and to figure out what it likes.
Yeah.
And what you like about it.
What is interesting, since we did both hot brewing and cold brewing with this tea for this month, is that cold brewing also gets all of the flavor notes, but in a very different way, where Gong Fu spreads them out and highlights each individual note pretty successfully. Cold brewing stacks them, and it gets you kind of with a powerful punch of some delicious oolong notes.
Yeah. We had some questions about some folks asking about how to cold brew. And what we're talking about is cold brewing is we're doing cool or room temperature water for several hours versus a brewing time versus something like a snap chill, which you might see, which is brewing with hot water over ice, and counting that the weight of ice towards the final end result of brewed tea, because you'll obviously melt that down. So let me just pull up that question real quick. Yeah, the question was, is there a difference between brewing hot and then cooling the resulting tea in the fridge versus brewing for a long time at a low temp? There taste difference between the two. Person's assuming because temps are different, flavor notes are extracted differently, or maybe the long brew time compensates for that. What about tannins and caffeine? The caffeine question and the tannin question I can't answer because I do not have a degree in chemistry and do not know anyone that I can ship off my samples to. This is a kind of an entertaining thing. In tea, folks will always been talking about caffeine extraction and tea being less caffeinated than coffee or what have you, which by and large is likely a misnomer. That is because you're able to get multiple infusions. Your distribution of total dissolved solids, TDS, which you measure in coffee, you don't quite have an equivalent in tea for that. And even if you ask a coffee shop, which coffee is more caffeinated, they're also not going to know without taking the spent puck of whatever coffee they're brewing, sending it off to a lab, who then bakes it and then cuts back on its chemical formula and goes reverse engineers it, which is something that I would really like to do. And I can tell you in the back of the book, Tea, History and Varieties by Camille Sinensis Tea House up in Montreal, they went right ahead and did that with some of their teas. The problem with this is they did that with some of their teas as brewed by a specific person on a specific day. So that's
everything changes the minute differences of caffeine in a beverage, but overall, tea and coffee have equal amounts of caffeine, on average.
Yeah.
The thing that people think is equating to tea having less caffeine is that it has an extra chemical called L-theanine, which slows the body's intake of caffeine. So you're getting the same amount of caffeine ingested over a longer period of time, which means that you're less likely to have the caffeine crash.
And I think that's something that we went over in a previous talk, but is always worth.
So it's worth remembering.
Yeah, and working on.
Yeah.
Like most of our things, we're trying to continue to build off a base of knowledge and information that will continue to add on.
Mhm.
What you might see here in my leaf is how much my leaf has expanded. This is a very tightly rolled oolong that opens up a whole bunch.
Yeah, particularly when you wash it first.
Yeah.
But if you, it's a little bit of the dust, but here's one of the pearls.
Yeah.
Each pearl has about 3 or 4 leaves and a bud.
And more than likely some
stick.
stem.
And a stem. And it's all tightly packed into this little guy. This is probably one of the smaller ones.
And this is done either by, or is done by mechanical means, whether that be a machine or human intervention of taking the leaf and rolling it. Machine, obviously, a little more efficient.
Yeah. But yeah.
Still got tasty things either way.
Yeah. There is something special about hand processing tea that some would say affects the flavor. And I think it does in a very subtle way.
Yeah.
Definitely can affect the price.
Yeah, that's the other thing as we get into Taiwanese Oolongs, is they've kind of are the perfect example of a specialty beverage market, where within Taiwan you'll have commodity teas as well as specialty teas. Commodities being, if you think about it, things that end up getting sold off as dregs to big companies like Lipton or Bigelow or what have you, which are all perfectly fine teas. And they're also at that same time have the market to sell at auction tea in the range of a few $1,000s per 600 grams. And some of my research and finding, I found a case back in 2014, if I'm recalling correctly, of a Taiwanese Shan, not ours, that when at auction and being evaluated, resulted in a price of $26,000 for 600 grams, which is mind-boggling.
Yeah.
And I really want to drink it, but I never would or could or.
Yeah.
How long does that keep?
We're getting asked how long does that keep, and
depends on how good your storage is.
Yeah, which is the thing.
Right, and then also there's the question of, are you intentionally aging tea, which will change. But High Mountain Oolong Gaoshan Cha from Taiwan is particularly special and tends to be priced higher. It has the methods to make it bring out really coveted flavors and keeps it looking really nice. The pearls of this month are like very brightly green and just look beautiful.
Yeah, and when it comes back to supply and demand, people keep buying it. So, and the demand is there's only so much space that you can grow the tea at over 1,500 meters.
Yeah. So there's limited supply every season. And there's only 2 harvests a year for High Mountain Oolong, which is fairly standard in the tea world, but often there's 3 or 4 harvests elsewhere. But the higher up you go, the fewer harvests there tend to be, elevation-wise.
Fewer harvests that you can get without damaging your prolonged benefit from the tea. That is, you could try to squeeze out another harvest, but you'll enter into the plant's dormancy stage, and if you're interrupting that too much, you'll lessen the life cycle of that plant.
Yeah. Taiwanese High Mountain Oolongs tend to have a really long dormancy, which is why they're so bursting in flavor.
And it gives that plant all that time to refocus its energy at the roots and pull in some really nice minerality from the surrounding area. This is a tasty tea, and I'm enjoying it. And as I'm drinking it, I'm getting a lot of those floral notes, things like daylilies, or got like a sweetgrass quality to it. There's also, I think,
This infusion has a lot more minerality, like a metallicness to it. We're on infusion 4,
Yeah.
I'd say.
has like also like a rockiness in that minerality of like granite or riverstone. If you've ever swam in a like really cold mountain stream and accidentally gargled the water, it's kind of got that like sootiness.
Yeah, the
Sooty.
sootiness of clear mountain water.
Yeah. You taste it, you don't feel it.
It's still pretty grassy, I would say.
Yeah. I think it's definitely a good tea for an evening like this. We're probably sitting about 80 degrees Fahrenheit here in Vermont.
Yeah. Fairly high humidity.
High humidity and
Supposed
some
to storm at some point.
clouds rolled in, and it definitely looks and feels like some storms might be happening. This is a nice tea that kind of fits that occasion.
Yeah.
Which is also a thing that I think folks can do, and I certainly do, which is pick my tea first based off of its flavor and secondly based off of its circumstances, which really by that I mean my circumstances. Do I have time to sit down and really enjoy a tea? Is it rainy? Is it super sunny?
Yeah.
I have that reflected.
It's always nice to pair your tea with your surroundings, which besides the fact that green teas tend to be most fresh in early spring, they also just taste the best in early spring because you're coming out of winter and feeling the brightness of the world, and you want to pair it with a nice bright grassy green. And now we're farther into the summer and have a calmer but still bright green oolong.
Yeah. Very nice tea. Now, I'm trying to think if there were any other topics that we quickly covered from some of those messages that we got of folks asking questions.
Yeah, if there are other questions,
We're
feel free to ask.
You were talking about, so this may be a question that you've addressed already, but you were talking about how Chinese style teas are more often pan cooked.
Yep.
And Japanese are more often steamed. Where does this fall?
So, yeah, if anyone couldn't quite hear that, we were being asked, going back to generally speaking, the Chinese teas tend to be pan-fried. Japanese teas tend to be steamed. And where does this fall on that line? That I'm not actually positive about how this one was fixed. I do believe, without positive certainty, without checking with our importer for it, that this one is a pan-fried. That being said, it is certainly a very quick pan fry.
Yeah.
Because it definitely has those more steamy vegetable notes.
Yeah, it's really reasonable to believe that this tea was pan-fried because if we look back at Taiwan's tea history, the way that we achieved, or they achieved, High Mountain Oolong as it is today was that Japan, when it was in control of Taiwan, brought in tea makers from the Wuyi mountain region of Fujian, China, to kind of hone the Taiwanese oolong process. So a lot of the processing of oolong in Taiwan is still based in Chinese style.
Mhm.
So the vast majority of it is likely pan-fried.
Yeah, we'll definitely get some exceptions, things, especially as you get towards Taiwanese green teas. Those I've found to be a pretty even split between pan fry and steamed methods. I'm not really sure exactly why that one breaks down that way.
I recall something in my research in Taiwanese tea when I was talking more about Taiwanese Oolong, which is a green tea that still while Japan was in control of Taiwan, they wanted to bring over more green tea to Japan specifically for themselves, and they would export every other type of tea. And so the Taiwanese green teas were made to replicate more Japanese flavors. So was intended to taste more similar to sencha than Chinese green teas.
Makes a lot of sense.
Which is why if you compare a Chinese Oolong to a Taiwanese Oolong, the Chinese Oolong will be a little bit more floral, and the Taiwanese Oolong will be a little bit more vegetal. It'll have notes particularly of like spinach and artichoke, at least from what I've found.
Yeah. I think that gives a pretty decent covering of this tea, and talked about Taiwanese oolongs, and we'll start to get into kind of talked about next month's tea, which Chase is pretty excited about. So
Yeah.
I'll let them start on that.
Yeah, next month we're going to go into yellow tea. We have a really nice Mogon Huangya. Mogon is the locale. Mogon Shan.
Shan Mountain.
Yeah. And then Huang meaning yellow and Ya meaning bud. So it's yellow tea made from bud. And I'm really excited about it because yellow tea is a fairly rare category of tea nowadays. It's pretty ambitious to produce. So there's not many true yellow teas out in the world. A lot of famous yellow teas were eventually converted to green tea processing to make it a little bit easier to produce. So a lot of teas with Huang, the word yellow in its name, aren't yellow anymore. But this is one that has stayed yellow. And what's also special about this is that it's made by one of the few female tea masters in China, and she has a lineage of herself, her daughter, and granddaughter are the only three people who know how to make this tea. So it's pretty special, and I'm really excited about it.
Yeah. So, and next month we'll look forward to exploring yellow teas, starting to talk a little more about tea lineage. So that is when we start thinking about, oh, I really want this tea, but I only want this tea if it so happens to come from these producers. We saw that a little bit going back to our first conversation about pu'er and famous factories where yellow teas and oolongs and black teas and even green teas we'll get into, talk about lineages, where what we've really started end up talking about is particular farmers and then particular families that are doing the full processing.
Yeah, if you really get into it, two teas of the same name made by two different farms are very different.
Yeah.
They'll still taste like what it's supposed to taste like under its name, but the subtleties of the tea is pretty different.
Yeah. So we'll have those topics, and I'm sure many more to explore next month.
Yeah.
I think until then, keep drinking good tea, keep having good conversations. As always, make sure you follow us and like and all of those things people do on social medias.
Send us questions at any time. We're
Yeah.
happy to answer.
And if you're in the Burlington, Vermont area, feel free to stop into the shop while we're open, and we'll be happy to share a pot of tea with you and share some more good conversations.
Mhm.
Thank you
Thank
all.
you.